I was trying to get context for what was happening, what was going on in Psalm 23. And you know, for me, context is king. I want to make sure that we put ourselves in the place and in the mindset as far as possible. So we start by acknowledging that the author of the psalm is King David, and he may have written it before he was king. And if he did write it before he was king, you know, for many years he was hiding from Saul or fighting Saul. Or before that, before he was anointed, he was a shepherd. And when Samuel came to Jesse's house and he said, I'm going to anoint one of your sons as king, he presented 7 of them. And Samuel said, no, 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 no. Oh. So do you have another son? And Jesse said, yeah, he's the little one. He's out in the field with the sheep. So this picture I have on the screen, I hope you can see the picture, is an example of David out with the sheep. And these in Israel, in the desert of Israel, these are considered to be green pastures. You just see these shrubs here, and the shepherd is keeping the sheep in line, keeping the flock from straying too far, but these are green pastures. So it helps, I think, to understand that the psalmist is not saying that everything will be lush and we'll all be multi-billionaires, but he's saying that the shepherd will do right by us. He will lead us in pastures where we can get what we need to sustain our circumstances. Another thing that happened this past week is that at my cousin's funeral, the priest used the illustration of a shepherd. And last year at my brother's funeral, the priest used the illustration of shepherd. What you will know is that Psalm 23, the most popular passage in the scriptures, is the go-to at funerals. It's the go-to in hospitals when people are sick and dying. It's the go-to in funeral homes. It's the go-to at funerals. So the question is, how did this passage become associated with death and dying? And a part of the answer is because, part of the scrolling, in the King James Version, there is a mention of, in verse 4, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And the word death right there is part of the reason why this is associated with death and funerals. But it shouldn't be. It's really a psalm for those who are alive. And if it's the pre-King David as shepherd who wrote it when he was out in the fields, remember he was with his harp and his whatever else, writing songs. He was a songwriter. And if this is what he's writing about, he's too young to be talking about death. So let me show you the place in Israel that is called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. It's the Kidron Valley. I want to go back to the scripture passage in the Orthodox Jewish Bible, which I've been using a lot recently. And I wish I could pronounce this, but this is the name of the place. Yea, though I walk through this place. And you see the uppercase here on the name tells you it's a place. So the Valley of the Shadow of Death is an actual place. Thankfully, there are versions nowadays that decide to step away from the death word. And for example, the NIV says, though I walk through the darkest valley, which helps because it takes the death word out of there, because the death word causes us to think about death, but there's nothing in the psalm about death. If this is indeed young David, he is like too early in his life. He has to go through all that fighting with Saul, and then the 40 years of being king, and all the challenges in his family life. So we understand it's not about death, and it is basically the perspective of a sheep. It is very possible then that David wrote this when he was a shepherd. He is surrounded by sheep. He is understanding or putting himself in a place to say, gee, here's what I am doing for my sheep. I wonder how the sheep perceives this. And if the sheep perceive David when he's a shepherd as a good shepherd, you can see why he would say, well, if I were a sheep, I would think I'm a pretty good shepherd. For example, let's try parenting. As a parent, you might think, I'm a pretty good parent. My kids just need to recognize I'm a good parent. Or whatever the situation be. So he is writing this psalm, this song, Ultimately, we know the Psalms were, this is the Jewish songbook, and therefore they're going to sing these in the tabernacle. There was no temple then, but this in the meeting they will sing these songs. So we ask questions about how it's written. And I've said in the past that Hebrew poetry, and it is poetry, had not rhyme the way we have rhyme, but it had what was called parallelism. So every two lines go together, and there is several forms of parallelism. I think I talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Synthetic and synonymous parallelism. Synonymous parallelism is where you're comparing two things. You're saying the same thing twice in a positive way. Antithetical parallelism is where you're saying opposite things, contrasting things. And then there's synthetic, where you synthesize, you bring two ideas together. But there are many forms of parallelism, and I'm not the expert, but the last time we were studying the Psalms, I mentioned some of this. So there's different forms of parallelism that are being used. The writer obviously is writing a poem, and we don't understand how to interpret that poem, but we understand it in our own context, and that is the case. I'm just reminding you that's Hebrew poetry written by King David, probably before he was king, when he was out with the sheep in the fields, in the green pastures. And again, this is a good day in Israel. In the deserts of Israel, the shepherd is happy to have these green pastures. But again, writing from the perspective of the sheep are happy because they don't have to find the green pastures on their own. The shepherd is doing all of the leading. He's scouting out where to go. And one of the things that when you have these vast distances between where they're feeding, he's going to cover, some people say 10 miles in a day. He has to make sure that the sheep don't wander too far away. So he has to manage to keep them corralled in a certain area, give them enough room to roam around to find a mouthful here and a mouthful there as they move around trying to get a bellyful. But he has to keep an eye on the sheep that is going up here on the hill. I think in this picture there's probably something, maybe it's not a sheep, but he has to keep his eye on all of them. He's not going to try to control all of them, because the thing with sheep is that they follow each other. But sometimes one would stray away, and he would try to rescue that sheep, and that's why he had the staff. The staff was the crook of the staff he put around the sheep's neck and pull the sheep back to where he needs it to be. And the rod was to beat off wild animals. Some people say to goad on the sheep, but sheep don't really need to be goaded. Goats need to be goaded more than sheep. At least that's my recall from my days of working with sheep and goats. I think I've gone into a long preamble there, so let's go to the actual passage and see if we can get started. I said I chose many versions here. Again, not clear where I was headed with them, but I wanted to go back to the King James Version because most people over a certain age, when you ask them the 23rd Psalm, they will recite it King James Version. So I'm just going to read here the 23rd Psalm, as close to King James as possible, the New King James. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's go back to the perspective that I was trying to give earlier. So here is the NIV, and again, they don't use the valley of the shadow of death. It's the darkest valley, and you can compare and contrast to see this poetry, compare and contrast to see where they're going with that. Again, from the Orthodox Jewish Bible, I looked to notice where they were putting uppercase letters, because I figure that that's significant. So here, shepherd is uppercase, name is uppercase, valley of the shadow of death is uppercase because of the place, and I guess that's about it. Just again to give perspective on what is going on. We know the words, but we're trying to look at it from a different perspective. Shepherding in the hilly terrain of Palestine required skill, patience, and courage to keep vigilant watch over a flock of sheep that were never far from very real dangers. Therefore, in the Hebrew mindset, a good shepherd was of high value. It is no surprise then that the psalmist puts God in the role of shepherd and himself as a sheep in the flock. No doubt the psalmist had in mind the Exodus story of God's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. As they left Egypt behind, they found themselves in a dangerous wilderness where God became their shepherd leader. A later psalm, number 78, a psalm of Asaph, sums it up as follows. God brought his people out like a flock. He led them like sheep through the wilderness. He guided them safely, so they were unafraid. How beautiful that goes with Psalm 23. Based on the faithfulness of God to Israel, the psalmist is confident to claim the Lord as shepherd. So you know that I wanted to tie the passage to some songs because that helps me to focus in. And one of the songs I chose says, "The King of love my shepherd is, whose goodness faileth never. I nothing lack if I am his, and he is mine forever. Where streams of living water flow, my ransomed soul he leadeth, and where the verdant pastures grow, with food celestial feedeth. Perverse and foolish oft I strayed, but yet in love he sought me, and on his shoulder gently laid, and home rejoicing brought me. In death's dark vale, the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no ill, with thee, dear Lord, beside me. Thy rod and staff my comfort still, thy cross before to guide me." Henry Baker says in the last verse, "And so, through all the length of days, thy goodness faileth never. Good shepherd, may I sing thy praise within thy house forever." Clearly a paraphrase of Psalm 23.
You had mentioned earlier that you thought he was a young shepherd when he wrote this, but my Wiersbe says that he was probably actually wrote this when he was later in life and possibly during the rebellion of Absalom.
Okay.
And that's why when he speaks of every, it said that he deals with some of the difficult things he experienced during his long walk with the Lord, which is why I never knew that the valley of shadow of death was an actual place, because I really did always think that it just meant that even if you got to the point where you were going through something that could possibly result in death, that God was with you. So, and that's what they're kind of implying in the commentary, that he faced all kinds of David faced all kinds of circumstances.
But clearly he's putting himself back in that role of being a shepherd. He's remembering his days of being a shepherd, for him to have the clear presence to express this. Those of us who have never been a shepherd can't really empathize with what a shepherd goes through. And he is clearly seeing it. He's remembering the places he has been, the hardships along the way. So yeah, I would tend to understand why Wiersbe would say that, because he's saying, gee, I'm going through this terrible situation here. And when he was a kid out in the field with the sheep, he probably didn't have any of those challenges.
Well, except for when he beat off the bears and the lions and stuff.
Right, you're right. But I thought that he was self-confident. He had the confidence. Because remember when his brothers were afraid of Goliath, he said, "Come on, guys, you're afraid of this thing?" And he went with a slingshot to attack a giant. So obviously he had a lot of confidence that the Lord would actually give him the victory in this situation. When none of his brothers, when the whole Israelite army was afraid of Goliath, he was thinking, "Come on, guys, you gotta do better than this. This is crazy." Remember, we talked about chiasms, this pattern A, B, C, D. So it's like a V on the side. You move in, and then you come back out. So the color code coordination here will give you a sense as to how this is working. So first there's parallelism, where a verse might have two ideas or the same idea repeated two different ways. So you see Yahweh mentioned in verse 1, Yahweh mentioned in the last verse. Lying down, dwelling. Leads me and guides me. Goodness and mercy follow me. By the way, one of the commentaries I was looking at said that, remembering himself as a shepherd, he would have sheepdogs. And the sheepdogs would be at the back of the flock. And this right here, the idea of goodness and mercy, is like two sheepdogs at the back of the flock, pushing the sheep along. Goodness is one and mercy is the other. I found that interesting because some versions don't say mercy. It says goodness and love. Goodness and love shall follow me all the days of my life. So there's this thing pursuing the sheep. You are the sheep. And you're being pushed along in ways. So there's the shepherd up front guiding. And then there's the sheepdog at the back keeping the sheep from straying. And Goodness and mercy follow me all the days of my life. What is interesting, given what Mary said, is that if he was having these problems in his life, we look at goodness and mercy following him all the days of his life, but we know David had lots of problems, lots and lots of problems in his family life. So it's good that he has that perspective. And if he's writing this for the congregations to sing at the tabernacle or whatever, then he is writing a song that's beyond his own experience, but a song that everybody can use to reflect and to meditate and to worship. But this is, as I said, this chiastic structure of the psalm. So it moves in lie down, dwell, leads, guides, the valley of the shadow of death. And they contrast it with the table. So this would be what I would call an antithetical parallelism here. The valley of the shadow of death and the abundance of having a table prepared, but still in the presence of enemies. The enemies are mentioned. So the valley of the shadow of death might be a dangerous place. And even in the presence of danger, God is going to prepare a table. And he's going to anoint your head, etc. And then the last bit of the parallelism, fear no evil, comfort. And then the central axis of it, for you are with me, which is a good central axis for the poem. You are with me. The whole thing is a psalm of comfort. God is with us all the time. One song says, in the morning when the joy bells chime, in the evening when the lights are low, God is with me everywhere we go. One of the things that comes to mind as I view that image of the shepherd going ahead of the flock and the sheepdog at the back, they're also on the outskirts as well. Whenever a sheep starts to stray, the sheepdog is going to go out there and try to corral it back in, so the shepherd doesn't have to always turn around and go get after that sheep. If the sheep strays away, then he might stop the flock. And the good thing about the sheepdog is they will prevent the others from moving away. But you're moving. There's always this motion. It was said that the shepherd would take his flock 10 miles, 5 miles in one direction, maybe 5 miles back, because they're searching for pastures. And they're just biting off a nibble here from a blade of grass, moving on to the next one, moving on to the next one. So it was quite an amazing journey to watch shepherds. And I was watching some videos of shepherds in the Middle East still doing that kind of thing. And a lot of them were young girls, female shepherdesses, I would say, wandering with their sheep or leading their sheep around the pastures of the Middle East to get a mouthful of green grass here and a mouthful of green grass there. So my question is more related to what do we understand or we know about sheep and shepherds?
Sheep have a reputation for being stupid.
The priest who officiated my uncle's son's funeral on Tuesday, he really made the sheep sound really dumb.
But don't they know their own names when the shepherd calls them?
Say yes, yes.
Okay.
They're smarter than goats.
Actually, I have a different perspective on that. My own experience is that the goats were stubborn, strong-willed, more like cats, and the sheep are more like dogs. So I don't know that I would say they were smarter. I would say they are different in their mind. Because I raised sheep and I would just take one sheep and lead it and the others would follow. It would just follow like, oh yeah, we're following wherever this one sheep is going. I was leading that sheep. So, whereas we had goats, and I could not get the goats to cooperate. So I don't know that they were smarter, just differently wired. Tell me why you think they're smarter.
You try to move that goat from one stake to the other, and he take off on you and drag you.
Exactly. But Samuel, give me your perspective again. Did you have experience that is different than mine?
No, but the obedience.
Okay.
Yeah. I was going to say, if you picked a sheep and started, was it a particular sheep that they would follow, or
no,
any sheep that you happened to? Because maybe they were really following you. It's just that you got the one to go and.
But when they were going into danger, if one wandered off into danger, the other will follow him. So I don't know. It wasn't like a parent thing. We're following the lead sheep. I don't know. It was just like they had this sense of. So have you ever seen a trail of ants? And one just following behind the other, and you see this trail of ants, and you're thinking, gee, where are they going? Well, I saw lots of trails of ants. I think it's how they're hardwired. But in my case, I was obviously taking them back home. So I would just usually I'd take an older sheep, a ram, for example, because I didn't want any trouble. I'd just leave that one, but the others would just line up. So we used to take them out to the field, and because we only had so much land, we would stake them into the ground with a rope. And they'd have a circle where they could roam around. Each one would have its own circle. So at the end of the day, I would go pull up the stakes and just take one sheep by the rope and lead it home, and all of the others, their ropes would just be dragging along the field as they came home. I didn't have to, whereas with the goats, I had to hold each of the ropes to guide them, otherwise they would not cooperate. So it was an interesting experience, and I don't know, maybe these are just Barbadian sheep I'm talking about, but it was like crazy to see how differently they operated. It taught me a lot about animals very early in my experience, and I was doing that from the time I was like 7 or 8 years old till I was almost 20 years old, because that was my situation. So, what do we know about shepherds? I know it may not be a smart question, but when you think of shepherds, what comes to mind?
But you can't help but go into your question number 2, as being a good shepherd or a bad shepherd, because Jesus himself described the good shepherd as being the one who actually owns the sheep. He's vested in them.
Mm-hmm.
A bad shepherd might be somebody who was just a hired hand and really didn't care that much about the sheep, and maybe wouldn't go to any extra length to save any sheep that got in trouble or whatever. Where the good shepherd cares, and everyone matters to him.
So a bad shepherd might be an inexperienced shepherd, because if you want to continue in that profession, you have to ask that question: do I want to learn from my mistakes? And if you realize you're doing things that don't make sense, that don't get the right result, once you realize that the sheep will follow, you operate differently, I would think. Okay, the sheep are going to follow, so I don't have to do this thing. I can go up and rescue one. I don't even understand that, though. You have to have help, because if you go off to rescue the one, the others might follow you too. So it's interesting that you can say he goes off and rescues this one and the others just stay in place. I have not personally had that experience, so it's clearly possible with the right set of circumstances, but you have to have something to keep the others from wandering off in a certain direction. Normally they would not wander off if there's a leader. So without a leader, they might wander off, and then once one goes in a certain direction, the others might follow that. And I'm sure you can think of examples or analogies of wandering off in the wrong direction.
If you have a bad pastor, that's like a bad shepherd, and it made me thinking about what Mary said, that ultimately Jesus is the good shepherd and the actual shepherd, and you have better or worse people that are, working alongside him. But the actual one who should be guiding us, the actual one we should be following, is not any man or woman, but the Lord himself. Because you can definitely have situations where a bad pastor, in his role as, shepherds, in quotes, leads the entire congregation astray in his or her own foolishness. And it happens.
Surely does. There are times that, even as I listen today, you can just have entire groups that get into this theological thing. And one of the things that fascinates me is that in heaven you're going to be sitting next to people from different denominations, and the things that you worry about in this realm will be totally unimportant. They say, oh yeah, we fought over that issue and it really made no difference. So we can major in the minors, or we can nitpick when we should not, and we should focus on the big picture. The expositors said the psalmist had in mind, we don't know that for sure, but he said the Exodus story. As they left Egypt, they found themselves in a dangerous wilderness where God became their shepherd leader. I don't know if anyone has thought about that before. Would you have associated this with the 23rd Psalm? Anybody?
I can see where it applies.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. Because you have a lot of confidence when you say that. He had in mind the Exodus story, God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt. So he led them by day and by night, and he provided for them. I can see it more as I think it through. He is providing for their needs. and it's green pastures, manna and quail, and striking a brook, striking a rock to get water, and then look around and they see nothing. And he's saying, "I'll meet your needs." And they're saying, "We want to go back to slavery in Egypt because it's better than this." It reminds me of the verse that says, "My God shall supply my needs, all my needs." And my needs, He knows what my needs are. And when you think of the shepherd and the shepherd knows what the needs of the sheep are. So the shepherd is going to lead the sheep where the shepherd believes the sheep should go to be nourished. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing that the sheep don't choose for themselves. By the way, Samuel, I'll tell you about the goats. Our goats would eat anything, whereas the sheep were more picky about what they ate. But the goats would eat anything. So you could get some wild bush and feed the goats and they would eat it, whereas the sheep would eat grass. So the sheep were pickier about what they ate. That's just my own experience. Question number 4. How might you characterize the experience the writer is describing in verses 2 and 3?
Well, again, he's talking about providing for needs. For food, for rest, for leadership.
I like the fact that it ends with, "For His name's sake." Because of who He is doing this. And I like the idea too that it is not what we in ourselves would think we need. Because if green pastures is indeed that picture I showed you, and you're thinking, "Come on, you can't be serious. This is not green pastures." And He's saying, "Yes, this is green pastures. I know what you need. I'm going to give you what you need, not what you want." Because sometimes we think of the things we want, and it includes lots of stuff and material things and things that if we had, I think this was said last week, people who win the lottery end up broke. We think we want certain things, and then we realize we really don't want them. They bring more angst in our realm than they should. And sometimes having to wander from blade of grass to blade of grass across a desert land and having that meet your needs is good for us, because we can be in a place where we just want things that we shouldn't have. There's a verse in the scripture that says He gives us what we want, but He provides leanness to the soul. So it doesn't satisfy us deeply. It satisfies us for a short period of time, and maybe we think it satisfies us. But a lot of this is just the thrill of the chase. You pursue trying to get stuff, and then you don't even know what you have. There are people who have so much stuff they don't even know they have it, because the acquiring of it is more important than the enjoyment of it. So I think that the idea that He will lead you, trust Him to lead you, rather than say, "Gee, this is what I want. Give me what I want." You say, "Give me what you know that I need," as opposed to what I want. He refreshes and restores my life. Again, when you look at the picture, you keep thinking in our 21st century mindset, a Western mindset, there's no way that I would want that as green pastures and restoring and refreshing. But the shepherd knows. The shepherd knows that it will suffice. And what He's doing is good for you. And when you think of the fact that they're walking 10 miles every day, the sheep are getting their exercise too, So even as you consume the meal, as you move around, you're getting necessary exercise. I think about that now because we drive down the street rather than walk. We sit most of the time. We're not being very active, but we need the exercise. And if you need the exercise, but you have to now go to a gym to get the exercise that you could have gotten by just walking a few more steps, parking farther away, doing things that are simple, you understand that meeting your needs is more important than giving you what you want. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But we live in a world of material abundance. And the idea of needs over wants is like annoying to some of us. Nobody wants to be in a world where you're barely making it through. But there's a beauty in not having, where you now learn to rely on God, His goodness and His provision. So I think that, I'm not saying go back to days of scarcity, but certainly we sometimes have way too much that we don't actually use. I'm guilty. Stuff that you can do without. Question number 5. What does verse 5 tell us about God?
In my commentary, it says that it's a description of God's protection and power, as David could feast in safety and security even though he was surrounded by enemies, or a victory feast at which David celebrated the defeat of his enemies who were prisoners without weapons and no longer dangerous.
I like that.
About be available to God's will, to walk in biblical concepts.
I like that too. So, while it does talk about the cup running over, just focus on the first stanza here. Prepares a table in the presence of my enemies. The table doesn't have to be a table that is lush. It's just that he is meeting the need. You are going to give me what I need, and no matter what the circumstances are, no matter who is opposing me, I'm going to trust that you will meet my needs. In the presence of danger, I'm not running away from you. I'm hanging in there. So even the story of the Exodus, it helps to understand that he's preparing a table before them in the presence of difficult circumstances. So I think what I like in reflection is comparing the Exodus story and the travails for 40 years in the desert, and even the picture we saw of what green pastures look like and what the valley of the shadow of death means is significant. It says God is going to meet your need. He's going to meet your needs. Because the majority of the people in the world, when they read this, they think of green pastures as having everything they want. There's no way that they could read this and have a Western mindset about it. They might think, how is God good when he's giving people in one place so much more than others? He is giving you what you need. And I'm not saying that I understand this fully, because there are many people who I know who have very difficult circumstances. When they read this, they need to find comfort in it too. God is meeting their needs without them feeling like, gee, he's not giving me what he's giving somebody else, so how is this even fair? Or why are there difficult circumstances in my own personal life? How is this God meeting my needs? So it's also like a vision statement too. I know that God will ultimately meet my needs, even if I go through hardship. It is said that many people use this psalm, recited this psalm, many martyrs on their way to the execution chamber. That people use this psalm for comfort as they were going to face their death. So it must be that they're looking past the physical life and saying, yeah, I trust you, that you're going to lead me in the right place. Even if I am going to be executed 5 minutes from now, this is the go-to psalm. Surely goodness and mercy, your unfailing love will follow me all the days of my life. Throughout the length of my days, I'm going to worship you. So what I like about it is how David basically was committing himself to God. Regardless of what happens, I will worship you. One song says, and I will worship you all of my days. Goodness and your love will follow me. Your hesed will follow me all of my days, and I will worship you all of my days. Throughout the length of my days, your house shall be my dwelling place. Elsewhere, David said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Remember, there was no temple. It was a tabernacle, it was a tent. But he was saying, I'm glad to be in the presence of God. So that's a good thing about it. He wants to be in the presence of God. When he goes there, he feels refreshed and restored. He feels that God is keeping him, the relationship is being maintained when he goes to God's house. He refreshes and restores me, leads me in the path of righteousness. Not by my earning it, but for his name's sake. And whatever difficult circumstances come my way, I'm not going to be afraid because I know he is with me. That's the comfort I see in this psalm. He will protect me, and he will guide me, and he will comfort me. Question number 6, what purpose is served by the rod and the staff? We kind of talked about that earlier, but does anyone want to offer any comment or commentary?
The shepherd used his staff to guide the sheep, directing them and setting boundaries for them. He used his rod as a weapon against predators by guiding them into safe places and fighting off their enemies. The shepherd's rod and staff were a comfort to the sheep.
You will have protection. You will have the assurance that regardless of what happens, God isn't going to leave you. Sometimes, like the Footprints poem says, sometimes you see one set of footprints and you're saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, you have to understand that he doesn't forsake. That's not who he is. He does not forsake. We might feel forsaken, but he doesn't forsake. What should be our response in the presence of enemies? Any personal experiences? What's a good response in the presence of enemies? Fight or flee? What do you do in the presence of enemies? Or what should we do in the presence of enemies?
Stay put.
Trust. Not lose heart, not lose faith. Believe that whatever happens, God is going to be with us. Because even if the worst that can happen in this life happens, if you believe in what the promise is, eternal life, then you transition from one location to another. You transition from one world to another. So we should not hold on too tightly to this life and its things. I think maybe last time I taught, I mentioned this song that says, "Men strive for the wealth of this wide wicked world. They seek after honor and fame. So lavishly sporting their diamonds and pearl, they put their dear Savior to shame. I'd rather be in heaven than to own all their silver and gold. I'd rather have Jesus than a palace." So anyway, that's the idea that God is going to meet our needs and we should not fear. It's hard to say that because built within us is the fight or flight mechanism. It's how to make sure that you don't allow that idea to overcome you when you are faced with dangers, that you just know how to call on God. I remember when I was young, I had this friend. She would, whenever there was danger, she would just say, "Jesus." And I kept thinking, you should not take his name in vain. She said, "No, I'm not doing that. I'm calling for help." It gave me a different perspective because I was annoyed by what she was doing. She said, "No, I'm calling on Jesus to help me." Every time she was in a dangerous situation, she would just say, "Jesus." So we're going to close. I want to make sure that we have touched on important points, but also I would like for you to comment what the psalm has meant to you or means to you, and also going forward, any truths that we have reflected on in this hour. We all know people who need encouragement right now, who are going through what are deep valleys, the valley of the shadow of death. What do you say to them and how do you say it?
Don't give up.
It's always darkest before the dawn.
I say many are the things I cannot understand. All about me mystery I see, but the gift most wonderful from God's own hand is his gift of grace. So we have to understand that, because sometimes we do feel like we're in a valley. And I've felt like I was in a valley several times this week. But this psalm has assured me that though I walk through the deepest sunless valley, that I will fear no evil, because he is with me. He will protect me.